The moment Earth sent its best diplomats to the Galactic Empire, the world held its breath. For years, humanity had struggled to find a place in the vast expanse of the universe. The Empire, a massive galactic power that spanned thousands of star systems, had always viewed Earth as insignificant. Yet, the diplomats, specially trained, highly skilled individuals, were sent to change that. The goal was simple: establish peaceful relations, open trade routes, and end humanity's isolation. The diplomats believed that by showing their goodwill and intelligence, they could change the course of Earth's future. What they didn't anticipate was the Empire's cold, calculating disdain for their mission. The Empire was a force of overwhelming technological superiority. Its ships were massive, armed with weapons capable of obliterating entire fleets in seconds. The diplomats, selected for their ability to negotiate under pressure, hoped to appeal to the Empire's desire for more resources. They were not naive. Humanity had known of the Empire's ruthlessness for years, but they believed that diplomacy, backed by human ingenuity, could open doors. However, they underestimated just how deeply the Empire believed in its own dominance. From the moment they boarded the Imperial flagship, it became clear that the Empire had no interest in equality or cooperation. As the diplomats entered the grand halls of the Imperial ship, they were met with a cold reception. The Empire's representatives, towering alien beings draped in ornate robes, barely acknowledged the humans as they took their seats at the negotiating table. Words were exchanged in clipped tones, an unsettling quiet hanging in the air. The Empire, used to being the unquestioned rulers of the galaxy, saw no need for diplomacy. They saw the human diplomats as nothing more than pawns in a game. The talks were little more than a formality, a way to appease the lesser species. It wasn't long before a chilling realization hit the diplomats. They were expendable. It was not a question of whether the talks would fail. It was simply a matter of how. As the hours dragged on, with no meaningful progress, one of the diplomats, a seasoned negotiator named Alan Rios, began to suspect something was terribly wrong. He had been around long enough to recognize when a deal was simply a facade. The subtle glances exchanged between the Imperial officers, the way their eyes flicked to the door every few minutes. It all pointed to one thing. The talks were a distraction, and the diplomats were being watched closely. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and alarms blared throughout the ship. Panic spread through the diplomatic party as the doors to the meeting room slammed shut. Security forces flooded in, their weapons drawn, and the humans were quickly seized. The Empire had no use for diplomacy anymore. The ambassadors, once seen as the key to peace, were now prisoners. The guards didn't bother with restraint. They treated the humans with contempt, dragging them away in shackles. As the diplomats were hustled to the halls of the Imperial flagship, Rios managed to send a brief transmission back to Earth, but it was rushed, filled with static, and fragmented. In his final moment of freedom, he managed to relay a single desperate message: "Even in chains, we stand for Earth." His voice cracked with fear and defiance in equal measure, but that message would become the rallying cry for a world that would not back down. On Earth, the distress signal was received with horror. Governments scrambled to decode the transmission, and within moments, the message was broadcast globally. The public's reaction was immediate. Protests erupted in cities around the world. People, who had once hoped for peace, now demanded retribution. The idea of peace with the Empire seemed naive, foolish. They had taken Earth's best diplomats, and humanity would not stand for it. The leaders of Earth, faced with the reality of what had transpired, could no longer deny the inevitable. The Empire had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. The news spread quickly, igniting a firestorm of emotions across the globe. Fear and anger swept through the population, but with it came something else: determination. Earth had been humiliated, but humanity had never been won to bow easily. The message from Rios was simple: Earth would not back down. The diplomats, held in the clutches of an empire that saw them as weak, had left behind a legacy of defiance. The world would not let their sacrifice be in vain. As the days passed, Earth's leaders held emergency meetings, their faces grim. The decision was made. Earth would declare all-out war on the Galactic Empire. There would be no more diplomacy, No more attempts to negotiate with an empire that saw human lives as little more than expendable pawns. The time for peaceful talks had ended, and the time for action had arrived. The world united behind this new cause. There would be no more passive waiting. Earth would fight, and it would fight with everything it had. In the darkest hours of that night, as the world prepared for war, one thing became clear. Earth would no longer be the quiet, insignificant planet that had once lived in the shadow of the Empire. The human race had been underestimated. But now, they were about to show the galaxy exactly what they were capable of. The Empire had made a grave mistake, and humanity would make them regret it. The decision to declare war was not taken lightly. Earth, united in its outrage and driven by the brutal capture of its diplomats, had a single purpose now: to reclaim their fallen heroes and exact vengeance on the Empire. But this was not a war of conventional tactics. Earth had never before faced an enemy of such staggering power. Their military forces were outdated, their technology primitive by galactic standards. Yet, Earth had something the Empire could never understand: the human spirit. The formation of the Earth Alliance was the first crucial step. It was a political and military union of all nations, pooling resources, intelligence, and manpower to create a singular force capable of fighting back. Governments set aside centuries of rivalries, understanding that survival depended on unity. The leaders of Earth knew that this was no time for petty disputes. Humanity's future now rested on a single collective decision: to fight back and to fight with everything they had. The first days were chaotic. The sheer scale of what needed to be done was staggering. Every available resource was commandeered. Factories were retooled for war production. Scientists, engineers, and military strategists were put to work, trying to make up for decades of technological inferiority. While the Empire's ships had hyperdrives and weaponry that could level entire cities, humanity had something they could rely on: their ingenuity. It wasn't long before Earth's engineers began to surprise even themselves. Using the remnants of old military hardware, civilian technology, and the few scraps of alien tech recovered from previous skirmishes, they started building prototypes for weapons and ships that could take on the Empire. It wasn't much at first, just the first cracks in a wall that had seemed unbreachable, but it was enough. The first breakthrough came when a group of engineers reverse-engineered a small piece of the Empire's technology, a drone that had been found during a failed trade mission. This drone, initially believed to be insignificant, held the key to understanding how the Empire's communication systems worked. Within days, a team of hackers was able to disable the drone's encryption systems, effectively decoding a vital piece of the Empire's military communications. This breakthrough was enough to inspire thousands of engineers, hackers, and inventors to contribute their own knowledge to the cause. What had once seemed impossible was now within reach. The Empire's vast technological superiority was not as insurmountable as it had first seemed. Humanity's ability to adapt, to learn, and to improvise gave them a fighting chance. Earth, once an insignificant outpost on the galactic fringe, was now a threat. At the same time, people from all walks of life began to volunteer for the cause. Civilians who had never seen combat suddenly found themselves in uniform, eager to defend their homes. Retired military personnel, once content with their peaceful lives, were called back into service. It wasn't just soldiers who joined the ranks of Earth's burgeoning resistance. Doctors, engineers, artists, and farmers all found ways to contribute. This was no longer a war for just the military. It was a war for everyone. But the path to victory would not be easy. For all their brilliance and resourcefulness, humanity faced a terrible moral dilemma. The Empire was powerful, ruthless, and capable of devastating consequences. The first human soldiers to step into combat, equipped with hastily constructed gear and prototypes, were all too aware of their vulnerability. These soldiers knew they were fighting an enemy that could erase them with a single command. But they also understood that the alternative, living under the Empire's oppressive boot, was worse. One such soldier was Lieutenant Sarah Williams, a young woman who had been a schoolteacher before the war. Now, she found herself leading a small unit of volunteers on a dangerous mission behind enemy lines. She had never fought a battle before, but she had a cause to fight for. As the first wave of soldiers marched to front, she kept in mind the lessons she had taught her students. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to act in spite of it. She wasn't alone. Everyone around her, from the most seasoned veteran to the greenest recruit, shared that same courage. Back at home, volunteers like Sarah were joined by those who had chosen to serve in other ways. A young hacker named Mark, just 17 years old, had found his place in the war effort not on the front lines, but at the heart of the digital battlefield. Mark's skill with computers had once been used for harmless pranks, but now he was part of a team tasked with launching cyber attacks against the Empire's communications networks. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he navigated the maze of Imperial firewalls, each keystroke bringing humanity closer to a world where the Empire no longer ruled with an iron fist. For Mark, every successful hack was a victory. Every piece of intelligence stolen a blow struck against the oppressors who had captured Earth's diplomats. As Earth's war machine slowly ground into action, one thing became clear. Humans were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting to preserve the values they held dear. Earth's citizens, from the poorest to the wealthiest, from the youngest recruit to the oldest veteran, understood that this was a battle for their way of life. They fought not for glory, but for the future, for the hope that their children would live in a world free from the tyranny of the Empire. But as the first skirmishes began, the true cost of the war became evident. Despite their ingenuity and resolve, humanity was still outmatched. The Empire's ships could wipe entire fleets in the sky with a single salvo. They had the advantage of centuries of technology, while Earth had only a few months to prepare. The loss of life was staggering, but each defeat only served to galvanize humanity's resolve. Each loss, each sacrifice, only fueled their determination to push forward. And in the midst of the growing chaos, as the first ships designed by Earth's engineers left their makeshift shipyards for the stars, one thing became clear. Humanity was not going to die quietly. They would fight, and they would make the Empire regret ever underestimating them. Earth's response was clear. The Galactic Empire had made the mistake of thinking humanity would bow to their might, but they had never faced the willpower of a species that had fought for survival since the dawn of time. Earth would rise, and they would show the galaxy that no matter how powerful the enemy, humanity would always stand strong. The first strike was a gamble, one that could either turn the tide of the war or mark the beginning of humanity's final days. The newly formed Earth fleet, still in its infancy, was a hodgepodge of hastily constructed ships, repurposed civilian vessels, and stolen Imperial technology. But it was Earth's best chance to send a message to the Empire. They were no longer the helpless prey the Empire believed them to be. They were a force to be reckoned with. The operation, codenamed Ember Dawn, was simple in concept but brutal in execution. The goal was to infiltrate the Empire's most secure supply depot, located on a distant moon, and steal critical components needed to upgrade Earth's fleet. Among the targets was a set of hyperdrive engines that could revolutionize Earth's ability to travel between star systems. It was a dangerous mission, an almost certain suicide run. If they failed, the entire fleet would be lost before it could even begin to make a dent in the Empire's overwhelming might. But if they succeeded, it could turn the war in humanity's favor. The stakes had never been higher. The operation began with a silent approach, relying on the element of surprise. The fleet, led by the newly commissioned warship Icarus, was designed for stealth. It wasn't built for speed or firepower. It was built to get in, get out, and do damage without ever being detected. The Icarus had been fitted with experimental technology, including electromagnetic scramblers that disrupted Imperial sensors, rendering the fleet invisible to the Empire's detection systems. For the first time in the war, Earth had a weapon that could catch the Empire off guard. As the fleet silently glided toward the supply depot, the crew felt a mix of excitement and dread. Lieutenant Sarah Williams, now serving as a tactical officer aboard the Icarus, was at the forefront of the planning. She had led a team of soldiers on the ground during earlier missions, but this was different. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a strike meant to shake the very foundation of the Empire's power. She knew the odds were slim, but her determination kept her focused. The Empire had underestimated humanity for too long, and now Earth was going to prove it. The moment they entered the moon's atmosphere, all hell broke loose. Imperial forces had detected a disturbance in the electromagnetic field and were preparing to intercept. The Icarus and its accompanying ships had to move quickly, making their approach under the cover of darkness. However, the Empire's response was swift. As soon as the ships broke through the atmosphere, the first wave of Imperial fighters swooped in, their weapons blazing. The fleet fought back with everything they had, but the Icarus was built for stealth, not combat. The first battle was brutal. The Icarus crew, despite their limited experience, fought with ferocity that surprised even them. The human ships, using tactics learned from the most desperate ground battles, darted and weaved through the sky, avoiding the Empire's deadly fire. Earth's ships were smaller, more maneuverable, but less armed. The Empire's fighters were larger, more advanced, and heavily armed. It was David versus Goliath in the truest sense of the word. The situation escalated when Sarah's team made their way down to the surface to carry out the second phase of the mission, infiltrating the supply depot. As the Icarus and its allies continued to hold off the Empire's fleet, Sarah led a squad of soldiers into the heart of the enemy's base. They moved quickly, relying on their training and the element of surprise. Their goal was to disable the Imperial defense systems long enough to steal the hyperdrive components and escape. Inside the facility, it was a maze of tight corridors and security checkpoints. The Empire's forces, though larger and better equipped, were not prepared for the sudden onslaught of humans who knew how to fight with everything they had. The team breached the first security gate with explosive charges and rushed in, guns blazing. It was chaotic, loud, and terrifying, but the soldiers were determined. They had one mission: retrieve the components at any cost. As the team moved deeper into the facility, they encountered heavy resistance. Imperial soldiers, massive and cold, appeared from every corner. The sound of blaster fire echoed in the halls as the humans fought their way through, each step more desperate than the last. The Empire was not going to let this theft go unchallenged. But despite the odds, Sarah's squad was relentless. They moved with purpose, driven by the memory of the diplomats who had been taken and the promise of revenge. At the heart of the base, they found what they were looking for: the hyperdrive components, guarded by an advanced security system that would have been impossible to breach for most species. But humanity had a unique advantage: the ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. Mark, the young hacker from the early days of the war, had joined Sarah's team. Using the knowledge he had gathered from his cyber attacks, he was able to bypass the security systems long enough to steal the components. It was a gamble, one that could have cost him everything, but it paid off. The components were in their hands. However, the mission was far from over. As Sarah and her team prepared to evacuate, the Empire's reinforcements arrived. A massive fleet descended from the sky, intent on wiping out the humans once and for all. The Icarus was still holding the line, but the battle was turning in the Empire's favor. With the components secured, the team raced back to the extraction point, fighting their way through base as the enemy closed in around them. In the final moments of the operation, the team made it to their ship, narrowly escaping as the Empire's forces launched a final attack. The Icarus lifted off from the surface, the stolen hyperdrive components now in their possession. But the cost was heavy. The human fleet had lost several ships in the battle, and many brave soldiers had not made out alive. The Icarus limped back to Earth, battered but victorious. The first strike had been a success. The Empire had been forced to retreat, and humanity had gained the upper hand, if only for a moment. But the war was far from over. The Empire would not take this defeat lightly. Yet, in that victory, humanity had proven something to the galaxy. Earth was not the weakling it had once been. Earth was a force to be reckoned with, and as long as humanity drew breath, they would fight until the Empire was brought to its knees. The war between Earth and the Galactic Empire escalated at an unprecedented rate. Following the success of the Icarus mission, the stolen hyperdrive components were a game changer, offering humanity a critical advantage. It was a victory, but it was also a symbol, a declaration that Earth, once a fragile and isolated world, had entered the galactic stage as a power to be reckoned with. The message was clear: humanity would no longer cower in the shadow of the Empire. And with this newfound capability, Earth launched a series of counterattacks that would begin to dismantle the Empire's stranglehold on the galaxy. The next phase of the war was marked by the creation of the Nova Fleet, a newly formed armada built around the hyperdrive technology humanity had stolen. With the ability to travel further and faster than ever before, Earth's forces were no longer restricted to fighting within their home system. They could now strike at the Empire's most critical supply lines, disrupt their operations, and engage in guerrilla warfare that kept the Empire on its toes. The tactics had shifted. No longer were humans relying solely on sheer numbers or brute strength. They were using speed, precision, and surprise, strategies the Empire had never expected from a species they considered inferior. The first major offensive was launched against a vital Imperial shipyard located in the Outer Rim, far from the core systems. This was a key facility for the Empire, responsible for the construction of their largest warships. Taking out this shipyard would cripple the Empire's ability to produce new ships, weakening their military capacity in a way that could not be easily recovered. The Nova fleet, now bolstered by Earth's best and brightest engineers, launched a daring assault on the shipyard, striking quickly and decisively. It was a risky operation. There was no guarantee that the Empire's defenses could be broken, but the mission was a success. The destruction of the shipyard sent shockwaves through the Empire's leadership, who had not yet fully realized the full extent of humanity's resolve. In the wake of that victory, Earth continued its relentless campaign of strikes against Imperial supply lines and military assets. The Empire had long believed that their dominance was unchallenged, but they now found themselves unable to predict where Earth's next attack would come from. Every successful operation was a blow to their confidence, and every failure was met with increasing outrage from their leadership. For the first time in centuries, the Empire was not the undisputed power in the galaxy, and that, perhaps more than anything, was what terrified them. But as Earth's forces gained ground, the conflict grew even more brutal. The Empire, desperate to preserve its authority, began to unleash tactics of mass destruction. Entire colonies were wiped out in retaliatory strikes, and the threat of planetary annihilation loomed large over every human stronghold. The Empire's cruelty reached new heights as their forces targeted civilian infrastructure, hoping to break Earth's will to fight. But they had underestimated humanity's resilience. One of the defining moments of the war came when the Empire launched an attack on Earth itself, a direct assault meant to crush the rebellion at its source. The Empire's vast fleet descended upon Earth's atmosphere, a storm of destruction poised to wipe out humanity's last bastion of resistance. In a move that would be remembered throughout history, Earth's leaders made the ultimate sacrifice. They ordered the deployment of a secret weapon that had been in development for years. It was humanity's last desperate gambit, an all-out counterattack that would either destroy the Empire's fleet or be the final, self-destructive blow to their own existence. The weapon, a supercharged energy cannon capable of devastating planetary-scale destruction, was unleashed in a final stand against the Empire. The blast from the cannon tore through the Empire's fleet, ripping apart their warships as they attempted to regroup. It was an act of desperation, but it was also an act of defiance. Earth had finally proven that it could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest power the galaxy had ever known. The destruction of the Imperial fleet was a turning point, and although the cost was immense, it sent a message that resonated across the stars. The Empire had underestimated humanity's capacity to fight and to survive. However, the war was not over. The Empire, though weakened, had not been entirely crushed. Their leadership was fractured, their fleet crippled, but they were still a threat. The conflict had reached a tipping point. Both sides were bloodied, and neither was willing to surrender. The ultimate battle for the fate of the galaxy loomed on the horizon. Earth had no choice but to continue fighting, knowing that the Empire would stop at nothing to quash the rebellion. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, humanity's spirit remained unbroken. In the final days of the war, humanity's resilience shone brighter than ever. The entire population, once divided by borders and ideologies, was now united in a singular purpose. The global military was backed by every resource Earth could muster, from technology to manpower. Volunteers poured in from every corner of the planet, eager to join the fight, knowing that their very existence was on the line. The future of Earth, of humanity itself, depended on the outcome of this final confrontation. As Earth prepared for the ultimate showdown, the lessons of the war were evident. Humanity had fought not just for survival, but for something more, for their right to exist as equals in the galaxy. They had fought for their dignity, their freedom, and their future. And in doing so, they had proven to Galaxy and to the Empire that humans were not a species to be underestimated. They were a species that would fight for their place among the stars, no matter the cost. The Empire had made its grave mistake in underestimating humanity, thinking them to be mere insects in a universe of giants. But now, humanity stood ready to deliver the final blow. The Galactic Empire would fall, not because of superior firepower, but because of the unyielding will of a species that refused to be crushed. As Earth's fleet assembled for the decisive battle, one thing was certain. Humanity would emerge victorious, and the Empire would never again threaten the galaxy. This was no longer a war for survival. This was a war for freedom. And Earth would not stop until the Empire was brought to its knees.